On this episode of Locked On Lightning, with all this talk that we have had about the 2004 Tampa Bay Lightning, we get a little bit more nostalgia going. We take a look back on 2020 and forward, some of the transactions that happened in that time, as well as some of the ones that should have happened. We talk about all of that coming up and more on Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Dankert. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Locked On Lightning. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the summer goes on, there's not that much sports, but guess what? The deals keep coming as FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On this episode of Locked On Lightning, with all the talk that we have had over the last week or so about nostalgia, just looking back on the Tampa Bay Lightning 2004 run, it came to my mind thinking, let's talk about some other things. Let's go back in time and see, what the Lightning did right, what they did wrong. And what I'm alluding to is more recently, and that is the 2020 onward. After they won the Cup, things got a little complicated roster-wise, and really, there was a lot of moves that were made as well as moves that weren't made then, and it helped in the short term, but as you see where we are now, it's still, we're still working our way through it. So looking at that, I just look back at really 2020 after we won the Cup, that there was, as really is the case with defending Stanley Cup champions, is you obviously want to keep the team together as best as possible because, why change what worked? Obviously, if you won a Cup, things worked out. And that was the case. But there was some things then that obviously we were all saying, as we all knew at the time, that the cap wasn't going to go up. It was going to stay the same. And obviously the Lightning needed to pay guys. And really, it didn't work out to a certain degree. So it's kind of taking a look back on that. I'm already looking at this roster, and it's just like a blast from the past. So looking back on the roster that the Lightning had then, I said it at the time, if you want to go all the way back to 2020, that was, I want to say July, maybe. No, later on, a little later than that. But I said it at the time that really what jumped out to me for the Lightning as an immediate fix for this team was two things. Was John Ruda and was Tyler Johnson. Now, as we all know, John Ruda ended up leaving Tampa Bay in free agency, ended up going to Pittsburgh. Tyler Johnson as well ended up signing with Chicago. And we'll just jump on. If you want to follow along, you could go on ESPN. That's where I'm looking at on 2020. You could take a look at that. So as we all know, the Lightning at that time, at the deadline, before everything shut down, they ended up picking up Barclay Goodrow. They ended up getting Zach Bogosian as a free agent, which was a pretty incredible deal to pull off, all things considering at that time and what the needs that the Lightning needed. And on top of that, they got Blake Coleman. And as we all know, that third line ended up being phenomenally good as the Lightning were coming off a really just a catastrophic ending to their season in the previous year. So really can't go really couldn't have gone better that way. As we all know, the Lightning ended up winning the Cup. And then really what stuck out to me in the closing months of really the NHL offseason, you really needed to figure out a way to get things done and give players really just deals. Matthew Joseph got a 2-year deal, one-way contract. Cirelli got a 3-year extension. Mitchell Stevens was a player from that team that I really thought that the Lightning should have tried to keep on their team, just because of how well he did in the face-off circle. As we all know, you look back at that Lightning team in 2020, just really bad at face-offs. It seemed like even when they had that big winning streak in February, really that this team was just not able to win face-offs consistently, and it did hurt them in some games. Obviously, it didn't help them, and it didn't really hurt them so much in the playoffs. But really, as you all know, if you look back on that last couple of sequences, and really that last face-off against the Montreal Canadiens in the final, Mitchell Stevens won that face-off, and then that's all she wrote, and that really helped the Lightning seal the deal in that game. Looking back on it, what I would have done differently really would have been, I would have tried to have figured out a way to hold on to him, Mitchell Stevens. Like I said, trade or just find a deal where you could get rid of Tyler Johnson, where you could have made a deal for Alex Killorn as well, and Jan Rutta as well. We kind of all knew to a certain extent, and I called it at that time. If you want to go back and watch that listen to that podcast, we weren't on YouTube just yet, but I said it at the time. Now is the time not only to trade personnel, but it's the best time I think you could have for them as you're coming off the Stanley Cup high, to go ahead and get your best value for them. And I was absolutely right, because if you look at what happened with these players, you really didn't get much in return back, or really anything. All three of these guys ended up walking out of Tampa Bay. And I'm sure looking back on it, a lot of Lightning fans would have wished that there would have been some sort of deal done. I really think that was something that was really lost in terms of, an opportunity for Julien Brisebois to be able to try and get something that you would be able to hold on for the next couple of years. And really we did not see that. And really that was probably the most disappointing part of it. And especially Killorn, who I think out of the three guys that we mentioned, he was probably had the highest value out of all those guys. And really, that's kind of the whole thing that really upset me about that was that whole thing was, you knew for about a year and a half, if not, maybe we could say 2, that really you could have been able to do more there, especially with Killorn. As for Johnson, I need to correct myself. He was traded. I wasn't exactly sure. I don't remember, people. This was 4 years ago. But practically you gave him up for nothing, because you ended up getting back Brent Seabrook's contract, who is out of hockey practically. There was no way the Lightning were going to keep put Brent Seabrook on, considering all the injuries he had at the time. So pretty much you gave up those 3 guys for nothing. And I felt like the Lightning could have at least maybe invested a little bit more in their minor league at then. I know why those moves were and were not made. A lot of it, I get, had to do with the fact that, you thought you had a good enough team to really go ahead and win another one, which they ended up doing, of course. And really, I think at the end of the day, though, you ended up setting yourself up for really a really difficult road ahead. I mean, listen, we all know you want to go into the off season after a cup and you want to go for it again and run it back as we know they did. But at the same time, it just wasn't one of those things that I thought, in my opinion, was feasible for this team. And we've seen it over the last couple of years. Really all the missed opportunities that Lightning could, looking back on it, would have hoped to have had by trading some players. And real quick with 20, after repeating in 21, it was kind of more of the same thing. The thing that really, I think, upset me and a lot of people too as well after that, trade Ryan McDonough a season later after losing to Colorado. We get it. He was just broken down. I mean, we'll see what he does with his second stint in Tampa Bay. The Andre Palat thing, I have mixed feelings about it because he's a very talented player. I firmly believe that. And I think that still he has a lot he could contribute in New Jersey right now. But like I said, what you could have done in 1920 definitely could have set you up for where you could have kept an Andre Palat if you wanted to. You could have kept even a David Savard if you wanted to. You could have even kept a big player that I really was high on at the time, and obviously Ross Colton. I think we could all agree, since Ross Colton's been traded to Colorado, that this team has not been the same whatsoever. And I think in the same breath as talking about who hasn't been the same, the player that comes to mind, really, it's Yanni Gourde. This team has not really had that edge with them. I would have very much been curious to see how Yanni Gourde and Nick Paul would have been playing together, how they would have been playing together full time, considering, the Lightning had to choose to not protect Yanni Gourde in the expansion draft, and that led to him going to Seattle, which is unfortunate. But at the same time, we'll talk more about it in the second segment of this episode. But it's one of those things where I think, you look at what some of the players you have now in this Lightning team, it's also a blessing in disguise. But coming up in just a little bit, if the Lightning did make some of those moves that we briefly discussed, because really this is a topic that we could spend an hour on, really. And I think that really, though, with just the moves or the possible moves that you could have at least, or the choices I would have made at the time, I think it would have been, we talk about, would they not only have repeated, would have had more success? Would have had less? We'll talk about that coming up in just a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about today's sponsor, and that is our friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook. They are America's number one sportsbook for a reason, because this summer FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. You could bet on baseball. You could bet on the Olympics. You got tons of things that you could throw your money on, and even horse racing. So that's why FanDuel is the best there is out there in terms of sportsbooks. So head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give me a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. You could subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Drop a comment below. I know it's like a very difficult, really, thing to look back on now, especially with the power of hindsight. But like I said, if you go back to the episodes that we recorded summer after the Cup final, and even the subsequent podcast that we recorded during the regular season, and even after they repeated, I always stood firm, and I just said from the beginning that I think that you look at Killorn, you look at Johnson, you look at Ruda. Like I said, yeah, Johnson was traded, but you could have packaged something. You could have packaged Killorn and Johnson together, or Ruda and Johnson together. I know you probably wouldn't have gotten a lot back, but at the same time, the Lightning's minor league system, as we are all keenly aware of, is depleted now, but it was definitely depleted back then. I mean, the Lightning weren't getting nothing. They were trading first-round picks every year. And so, at least if you got draft picks, it would have made more sense. Now, obviously, with that, yes, the issue there would have been, you would have gotten blowback from the fan base, deservingly so. You just won a cup, and you are arguably the best team just throughout the course of the playoffs, not even going up into the final. But it was also the way you won the final that I think a lot of people outside of Tampa Bay as well were convinced that the Lightning could have very well were going to repeat, and that they did the following year, beating the Stars. The Canadians, but previously beating the Stars. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact, and we kind of, I think, briefly discussed it or have hinted at it throughout the course of the season. Really, the East wasn't as packed in terms of talent as it is today. The Panthers were still on the cusp of being a wild card team. Boston was Boston. Toronto, they were probably less reliable then than they are now. But other than that, Carolina was a pretender. The Rangers were in the middle of a short rebuild. You didn't really have a lot of teams that were threatening you coming out of the East. Washington, they were starting to show their age. Pittsburgh, really nothing there either. So really, I get why you went for it and stayed with what you had at that time. But like I said, you won 2 cups, went to 3 straight finals. But the subsequent years that followed were really just not what you were expecting or hoping from this Lightning team, especially this past postseason. And I get it. We ran into the eventual Stanley Cup champion, but still, I mean, there's ways to win as well as set yourself up good for the future. And we haven't seen that up until this summer. We have not seen that from this Lightning organization. But if they did make the moves back then, the question now that you have to ask yourself, do the Lightning repeat? Do they go to the Stanley Cup final the following year against the Colorado Avalanche? What happens even after that? And I will say that, if you do deal away Killorn, if you do deal away Johnson, and Ruda, maybe the conversation at least is had, or at least the possibility is there that you can hang on to Yanni Gourde. Especially going into that second cup run, as well as he did play that year. Killorn, you could see the writing was on the wall. He was just too beaten up at that point. And then the following years, obviously, we know what happened there. But I think that, like I said, that the Lightning, I think, would have been better off. And I think that, though, they may not have won the Cup in 2021, they probably would have gotten pretty dang close. I think they would have had enough momentum there. If you do make those deals, or some sort of deals where you are able to move those 3 players, I think at least you still have enough momentum to get you to the Eastern Conference Final. And if history stays the course with the opponents that you have, then I still think that you could beat New York for the second time in a row. And especially if they hang on to Yanni after the expansion draft, let's say instead of Gord, and this is on the premise of if they were able to keep Coleman and Goodrow. But I will say, though, in hindsight, most likely you wouldn't have been able to keep all three. I think the odd man out in that situation probably would have been Coleman, where most likely you would probably leave him unprotected, lose him in the expansion draft. But I think in the long run that works out for the Lightning, because then you could just throw Colton into that mix, and you have Colton, Gord, and Goodrow on that third line. And if you stay the course with history, like I said, you end up picking up Nick Paul. Gord maybe goes to the second line, or depending on how everyone's gelling together. I mean, because like I said, the names look great on paper, but at the end of the day, you don't know how these guys are going to gel together. I think they have probably, if I had to bet money on it, they probably have around the same amount of success. Do they win a cup? That's really a toss-up, and I think that really it really depends on who you're asking. For me, I honestly would say no. Then again, I look at the players that we talked about that would, in my opinion, would have to be out the door going into that season. Did those guys make a big enough did they make a big enough impact to win a second Stanley Cup? Not really, but you can't really sit there. And that's where really the difficulty, when you're asking would they have more or less success. I would say probably the Lightning would struggle in certain situations where if you had a younger player or a newer player, you don't necessarily have the vet in that situation. Yeah, you could see a scenario in which you're maybe losing out on something. But I think in the end, really, not much changes in terms of end results, especially a cup. I think they could get to a cup final. If they play the Canadiens, then I think definitely that team minus Killorn, Ruda, and Johnson, I think that team still wins the cup. So wrapping things up on the show, just want to take a minute one last time to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Go ahead, drop a comment below this section, this video in the comment section. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'm sure we'll get a lot of opinions on this subject. And join us tomorrow as we will continue. I know I said yesterday that I wanted to continue Game 4 of our 04 rewatch, Eastern Conference quarterfinal against the New York Islanders, but this was something that I thought of earlier today, and we haven't really done anything pertaining to this, looking back on those two cup years, what we would have changed, obviously with hindsight, but if you've been a listener since day one, I've been saying these things as we've been going along. It's not like I'm just jumping in right now. But now we're talking about what can Julien Brisebois do to maybe not repeat history. Obviously have the same success, but like I said at the top of the show, it is possible in the NHL, if you're aggressive enough and if you're creative enough, to be able to win cups and rejuvenate your farm system and just your roster in general. The Detroit Red Wings did it for years. The Penguins did it for years. The Blackhawks did it for years. The formula is there. It's not an out of the box concept for an NHL franchise, especially in a league that has so much talent all around the NHL. And in the AHL, and as well as from coming overseas from, Europe as well as Canada, you have so much talent around the world where, unless you're being blatantly negligent in terms of drafting and trading and just worried about the dollar amount that you look at when you're looking at the salary cap, it is something that can happen. And I think that we have started to see it with the Lightning this offseason. Trading Mikhail Sergachev, I thought was, a lot of people may disagree with that, and that's perfectly fine. At first, I didn't feel comfortable about it. But I think in the long run, I think once we get into the middle of the season, I think it'll turn out to be a good move, especially when you get Connor Geekie out onto the ice, because I really fully expect him to be at the NHL level, if not the beginning of the season. But at some point this season, I would expect Geekie to be in a Lightning sweater. I think that we're starting to see that, and unfortunately, right now it's something that it was almost his hand was forced in that regard. But I think it's really something that you need to continue doing and really should be your game plan. I've talked about it all summer long, and even as soon as the playoffs ended, I talked about it with really more so Chernak. I know you're not going to get a lot for Chernak right now, but I would imagine, though, if Chernak plays well and he stays healthy, I wouldn't be surprised, even if the Lightning are playing well and are in a playoff race, whether it be for one of the top spots in the Atlantic or in a wild card spot. I wouldn't be shocked if Chernak is somehow dealt away of course, with salary retained. I mean, in today's NHL, unless the player is phenomenally good, you're not going to really see any team hold on to that much salary, especially with Chernak's contract. Take on that much money. But I think that really that would probably be the next step. And if the Lightning are out of it, which I would kind of be shocked. I mean, with this roster, with all the pieces that you've lost and all the pieces that you've gained, I think that this team is still very good. I still think this team is a playoff contender. But I wouldn't be surprised if Julien Brisebois kind of pulls the trigger on a deal as we get to the trade deadline and we see that maybe this team isn't heading in the right direction, and he kind of says, let's make a deal and get some prospects, get some trade, some picks, and see what we could get. I would be actually very shocked, even if this team is in it or even if they're on the cusp, if we start dealing away first round picks again. I think that maybe he has learned his lesson. I said it earlier a couple of weeks ago. I think, you're going to see a different style of managing this organization, I think, going forward from Julien Brisebois. I think what you're going to see is a guy that is very conscious of how valuable now first round picks are, and that you don't necessarily have to trade them every single year. You got to make some picks in the first round. I mean, now that you have some holes at the NHL level that you're going to have to plug up with Syracuse, you're going to have to replenish that supply in Syracuse. And how do you do that? You do that with draft picks. And it just can't be third, fourth, fifth picks, sixth and seventh picks. You got to do 1 through 2. You got to get those picks too as well. So I'd be very shocked if we see the same old story from him after the summer that he's had. But those are some of the ways that I really think that Julien Brisebois could really just continue to have a winning team at the NHL level, have a team that could compete, that a team that could be in it every single year. Because you do still have a very good core after you've lost your captain. And from how he conducted himself after that whole situation went down, it seems like the Lightning ended up on the better half of that. And now that's kind of Nashville's issue. But I think that, you got a good core, and, it's not like you have to go out there and get a superstar at the deadline. You have to go out there and get a guy who could be a depth player, score a little bit, play a 200-foot game. And I think that, that's not necessarily going to cost you a first round pick. So really that's something that I think we'll see, whether it be before the season or at the trade deadline. So let me know in the comments below how you feel about all of that. We talked about, 2020, 2021, 2022. Those 3 seasons will live forever in Lightning history. It's going to be interesting, not only, now looking back on it 2 years later. It's going to be interesting how we look back on it 10 years from now, and 15 and 20, and how very well those decisions made then could very well dictate the subsequent seasons, even after 2022. So we'll have to stick around and see how history unfolds. And tomorrow we'll continue our 2004 rewatch, as we'll be going into Game 4 of the 2004 Eastern Conference quarterfinals against the New York Islanders. So in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.